Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Breaking Badness, our book club mixdown. We kicked this off in late 2023, and since we've had about 4 episodes dedicated to books, we and our guests have found beneficial to careers in cybersecurity or just information regarding cybersecurity and Infosec. And we wanted to take a moment to share our favorite moments from those episodes. And we're very much looking forward to continuing to talk about books in 2025. If you have one that we haven't mentioned yet, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Our book club mixdown is all about revisiting our book club episodes from this past year. And we'd like to gift a lucky listener one of the books we discussed, John DiMaggio's The Art of Ransomware, an investigator's guide to espionage, ransomware, and organized crime. In order to enter, comment on our LinkedIn post on this episode with the phrase "book it" to be entered into the raffle. You remember that Book It program, right? With Pizza Hut? We can't send a pizza, or maybe we can. We probably can. I haven't looked that deeply into it, but we can provide a listener with a book. So without further ado, here is our Breaking Badness Book Club Mixdown. Thanks for listening.
I'm your co-host, Callie Fensel, and with me from Recorded Future is ransomware sommelier Alan Liska, and from Analyst One is Chief Security Strategist John.
Yeah, it's funny. Cyber criminals that have read the book too, which I think is that alone is very rewarding that they would take the time, but not a single one of them bought it. They've all downloaded it legally, and that's the first thing that they always tell me. And I'm like, okay, well, let's get past the fact that the years of work you downloaded. But I'm glad that you read it, and I've actually had some interesting conversations, and I always try to get their opinions. And I've gotten some criticisms because they're either Russian or in Eastern Europe type of thing, where they don't like something, but I've not gotten, they've all said it's fair. And I think that's because I didn't just write that about, publisher was very direct. I had to also write about the US and their part in espionage and things of that nature. And that part was a little challenging because of my past life with the government, but I was able to apparently do that good enough that the book came across as fair and not just one-sided. That was definitely a real challenge writing it, because it's hard to not be biased when you spent years working for government intelligence agency and then you have to write about it, let alone getting the thumbs up that it's okay to publish something publicly like that. It was a challenge for sure.
Maybe we should just back up a little bit. We haven't even said the title of your book yet, which is The Art of Cyber Warfare, an investigator's guide to espionage, ransomware, and organized crime.
The first half is about telling stories. It's about a lot of cyber espionage and ransomware incidents. And while I don't say it in the book, I would change this if I was to go back and write it again today. Many of the stories in there, I was part of those investigations. I was in the heat, in the middle of it, but I wrote it from an outside perspective because it's hard, like I said, it's hard to get things always approved when you've done the type of work that I used to do. So I took myself out of it. But anyway, my point is that the technical aspect of my book was more of, I have to put technical stuff in it if I'm going to write a technical book. But my passion is the first half of that book, where it's telling really interesting stories about espionage and ransomware attacks and the things that happened behind the scenes, and just sharing those stories. That's what I really enjoy. What I have learned about me, and there's no logic behind this that I can figure out, but when I go do research, I collect all this information and data. And when I start to write, even though I try to do analysis before, for whatever reason, when I actually start writing, I connect. The Ransomware Diaries is a great example of that, because when I wrote that, I had no idea what I had until I was writing it, and I started connecting all these dots and realizing the much bigger picture and how it all fit together. And that's really, for me, where the magic happens. So I always wonder, because so many analysts don't like to write, and I always wonder if that's just me, or if other analysts would, that if they were to actually write their own content versus being an analyst or a researcher or a company where you have a team that writes it for you. I've always wondered if they would have that same experience where they connect a lot of extra dots, or if it's just me. When I wrote that first volume, I put my face and name on it. And when a threat actor realizes who you are, and your accounts or your personas are burned at that point, because they realize who you were that they talked to and how you got the information, now you're on their map, and now you're on their radar. And like Lockbit had then taken my face and used it as their avatar, and I was on one of the dark web forums, and I was like, when I first saw that was such an oh crap moment. But it ended up being something I've learned with the Russian culture is, even though they did that out of a sign of respect. Wow, you did some crazy shit, and we'll give you props. And they weren't. It wasn't an adversarial relationship. Now they talk to me a lot less now, but when I do talk to them, I talk to them as me. I say a lot less. I still talk to them fairly regularly when incidents happen, but I've moved on to other adversaries since then. But my point is that literally, I risk my ass doing the work that I do. You never know what's going to happen. You're dealing with some of the most notorious criminals in the world that make hundreds of millions of dollars a year and have resources to make you have a really bad day. So yeah, I did all that, and I was so proud of the work. I feel like it was some of the best work I've ever done in my life. And so I was trying to compel people, hey, if you enjoyed the research, because it's always free, the research, that's one of the deals I had with Analyst One when I came here, is that my research would be public, it would be free, and we would share the information, because so many organizations today charge for that. And it's important to me that I really want to make the research available and make it so that everybody can benefit from it and use it. Doing everything at a public level brings risk.
And that is one of the things that I think John's writing and all good cybersecurity writing has to have, is that storytelling. If you get too caught up in the CTPs, that's the technical aspect of it, you miss the forest for the trees. You have to be able to tell a great story.
Yeah. One of the books that I just read also in the past year was Hunting Cyber Criminals, which is a book by, I hope I say his name right, Vinny Troya, pretty well known in our field. But I picked it up and I really could relate to a lot of the engagements that he has done with cyber criminals. And I really enjoyed the storytelling in addition to some of the technical aspects that are in it.
Books that have been recommended on this podcast are already amazing and absolutely the books that everybody would read. What surprised me was nobody had suggested Countdown to Zero Day by Kim Zetter yet. Absolutely amazing book and should be required reading for anybody in cybersecurity. Kim is one of the best journalists in the business, and her book really does a great job of understanding what's going on in the world of cybersecurity. Even though it's a little older now, it really is a great book on background. So that's going to be my first recommendation.
Can I say one thing?
No, go ahead.
I promise I'm not going to hijack this. Yeah, that book, I read that book a couple of years ago. It is one of my favorite books in the field that I've read. But what's so crazy about it, and I didn't realize this when I read it, is part of the main storyline involves Symantec. And it was literally, I didn't work there at the time, but it was the team that I worked on for 7 years after that event happened. So as I was reading it, and in some of the scenes are describing some of the conference rooms at our building out in California, and I'm like, I've been in that conference room, and I'm reading the players involved, and I work with these guys every day, or I did. So yeah, that one it has a place in my heart.
Yeah,
It's
and I guess I should clarify
agree.
when we talk about Countdown to Zero Day, the 0 day in particular is the Stuxnet 0 day, really well known. I won't go into details of that. John, it's funny that you mentioned you worked for that group, because I used to give them grief because for so many years they coasted off of Stuxnet. Like, they would go to meetings and, look, we found Stuxnet. And they'd be talking to not an Iranian nuclear power plant. And so it's great that you found that, but
right.
maybe what have you done for me lately? Yeah.
Right.
And again, fantastic research by the Symantec team, but fantastic telling of the story by Symantec or by Kim Zetter. And that is one of the things that I think John's writing and all good cybersecurity writing has to have, is that storytelling. If you get too caught up in the CTPs, that's sort of the technical aspect of it, you miss the forest for the trees. You have to be able to tell a great story, and Kim does a great job of that.
Excellent. Yeah, and we have an episode in the pipeline too where one of our domain tools folks talks about Countdown to Zero Day as well. But absolutely, that doesn't mean we can't keep talking about it, because I think it's important. And especially, and I don't know if you both have any more insight into this, but that my domain tools colleague, Ian Campbell, he talked about Kim Zetter's book, because he goes, I don't know if there are a lot of books by female or non-binary authors in this industry yet. And he had asked on Mastodon, but didn't get a lot of good feedback. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. You've already mentioned This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends by Cole, which is another great book. So that's a good one. So
Perfect.
My next one is Active Measures by Thomas Rid. It's a very long book about the secret history of disinformation and political warfare. Rid does a really great job of looking at all sorts of disinformation campaigns, and so much of what we do now includes disinformation and misinformation. It's something that you have to take into account when you're doing any kind of security analysis at this point. And so understanding the history of that, and Thomas is one of the best at this. In fact, he and Kim actually teach a course at Johns Hopkins together, which would be incredible to be able to get into and take that course. The final one that I'm going to recommend is not a security specific book, but it's Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel. It is a good book for understanding how to be an analyst. We all have our biases. We all have kind of our prejudices, and figuring out how to step back and think about these things in a longer way. So that's the whole point, fast thinking versus slow thinking. Like, how do you separate yourself from your biases and your prejudice when you're doing analytical work, when you're supposed to be, as John does, when you're supposed to be writing about these people that are doing sometimes terrible things to victims? How do you separate yourself from that and be able to do this? Or if your assumption is that there's no way this nation state can carry out this kind of activity, but the bunch of evidence is showing that they really are, how do you overcome your biases so you can, effectively report on that? And I think all analysts need to read that, simply because we need to be able to separate that. There's especially the longer, like I reread passages of this book all the time, simply because I know as I've been in here longer, I have my default opinion on things, and I know that it needs to evolve sometimes, except for one area. And a good friend of John's and mine, Jackie Coven, who works for Chainalysis, likes to tell me that cybercrime really accounts for about 1% of cryptocurrency transactions. And I refuse to believe that, because everything I see is terrible that's involved in cryptocurrency. So I will not change my bias on that, no matter how much evidence you give me to the contrary. Cryptocurrency is bad and it does bad things. But I'm willing to own up to my bias in there.
I think one of my favorite books, which is really dated now, but it's a book that when I first read really inspired me and is still a great historical book, is there's people that hate this book or love this book, but Inside Cyber Warfare by Jeffrey Carr. And I just, when I first read that, it really made me want to do more in this field. And if you can't tell by the name of it, it was a bit of an inspiration for the title of my book, but that's one of my favorites. Mm-hmm. A go-to that I use for work purposes, but I buy every volume when they update it, is OSINT Techniques from Michael Basil. It's phenomenal. The information in there is great, and he really explains things well and gives you lots of resources, and so that's something that I enjoyed a lot. And I feel like I can't go without at least mentioning the ransomware hunting team. That was Renee Dudley and Daniel Golden, and I got to meet Renee at the release party for that. The only thing that I can say that I don't like about it is that me and Alan are in our own little ransomware gang, is what we call it, with some other researchers. They needed to have a different name, so we could have written one with that name. But besides that, I think it's a great book. Those are some of my favorites. The other one I was going to say, Alan already said, which is Countdown to Zero Day. That's probably one of my all-time favorite research type of books and storytelling.
I think this kind of leads us nicely into, Ian, what you said about not staring at a screen all day, because my first pick for my Infosec book it's an ebook, but it's Blue Nomicon, the Network Defenders Compendium, shared by Splunk earlier this year. And I say not looking at a screen all day because I did this mamma jamma of an ebook. I printed it out. I'm sure Daniel will be very mad at me for printing it out, but I'm like, I cannot stare at the screen and read this whole thing. I'm not quite sure how long it is. Actually, let me pull it up. Oh boy. It's over 100 pages. Oh boy, it's still going. 136. And just to take people through what Blue Nomicon is. So I actually was curious about the title. I heard about Blue Nomicon from John DiMaggio, who I met at RSA earlier this year, and he's actually a contributor for Blue Nomicon, I remember. But I looked it up, and Nomicon is a book of knowledge on a specific topic. So we're looking at blue teaming as the specific topic of knowledge. So that tracks. And I will say one of my favorite things about this book I'm just going to call it a book because 136 pages, that's a book. It's not just an ebook. I love the illustrations that are in it. There's not a ton overpowering it, but the ones that are there, it's like medieval meets tribal meets like futuristic. It's very well done. And the tone of it flows together so nicely in a way that you might not think an industry book would. It's a compendium of essays from a lot of different people in the industry, people like Sharon DeGrippo, Richard Holland, Jamie Williams. He is a friend of the podcast. He's got an essay in there. Ashley Benj, and of course, John DiMaggio, and so many more. I'm not sure how many in total, but it is broken up into 3 parts. The first is Council of the Sages. And that section is for those who are recognized as leaders in the industry and the importance of good leadership in the fields. So those are essays dedicated to that subject. And then the second section is called The Wisdom of Cybersecurity Wizards. And this is more of the information of stories from the field from practitioners. And then the final section is Tales from Blue Team Heroism, which is what they describe as more esoteric strategies needed to protect oneself from threats. So it leads up to these more intense stories from researchers, which is really cool. But yeah, this book is talking about incident investigation response and techniques for safeguarding against internet badness. It's really cool. I think it's on purpose, like Lord of the Rings in terms of storytelling. It's really cool.
So I've got 2, and one's kind of normal and one's less normal. First one I'd say is the more normal one, which is Countdown to Zero Day by journalist Kim Zetter. She's well known to anyone that pays attention to the Infosec space. She's been a powerhouse journalist for more than 2 decades now, I think. In a micro sense, Countdown tells the story of Stuxnet in detail that wasn't available previous. It's exhaustively researched and compellingly told. And in a larger sense, Zetter lays out one of the first deep dives on the idea of a digital weapon and the philosophy and the debates surrounding it, including a bunch of background from some of the folks in the actual first working groups in the Pentagon and other institutions that were wrestling with these topics really before anybody else. It talks about the steep rise in offensive cyber operations, especially of the surveillance sort, and the development of both government and private sector ways of understanding and mitigating this whole new environment. It's a fantastic book. I think it was 2014, 2015 that it came out. So it was one of the first real deep dives in terms of InfoSec investigative journalism that I can recall.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure our listeners are probably familiar with Kim Zetter from her work with Wired, too.
It will also nicely dovetail into my recommendation, but I'll wait my turn. But it's a nice complementary text.
Nice. Yeah. Zetter also keynoted Black Hat 2022, which was really fun to see in person. And she's always worth listening to, especially the ongoing Wired article. She's one of the reasons that I'm a paid subscriber to Wired. So I definitely enjoy her writing. My second book is completely unrelated to InfoSec. It's a book that was originally recommended by Swift on Security, the social media personality, although that doesn't do Tay justice. But Tay recommended Normal Accidents by Charles Perrow. He was a Yale sociologist, and he's writing this book in 1984, and it has nothing to do with InfoSec, and at the same time, everything. He goes through a bunch of industrial accidents and industrial systems pretty painstakingly, from the nuclear industry to air travel, petrochemical plants, marine accidents. He does an excellent job at understanding accidents as results of system interactions, including the humans involved, and how complex systems in particular are prone to surprising and unexpected interactions. This plays deeply into technology in general, IT in particular, and security almost perfectly, I'd say. Perot goes into two things in particular detail: interactive complexity as a system characteristic that increases the likelihood of the system performing or not performing in unexpected ways during a critical incident. And he also goes into the quality of loosely or tightly coupled systems. So a tightly coupled system is processes that happen very fast and can't be turned off. The failed parts can't be isolated from other parts, or there is no other way to keep the production going safely, which I'm sure doesn't sound familiar to anyone who works in software or software engineering or IT engineering anywhere. Having come into my own in technology as someone on the sidelines in IT, but having the privilege of watching things like Farsight Security Engineering, stand-ups, or domain tools, scrum of scrums, it's a way of observing that appeals greatly to me. If interactive complexity and tight coupling inevitably will produce an accident, Perot says, I believe we are justified in calling it a normal accident, which is where the title of the book comes from. This refers not to frequency of the accident, but that it's an integral characteristic of a system, and such accidents are a deep part of IT and security. So the book itself, again, having nothing to do with software or security, has everything to do with it.
My recommendation pick is This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyber Weapons Arms Race by Nicole Perlroth. I could not put that thing down. I couldn't hit pause on it. I think I burned through it on a weekend doing yard work or something, listening to it nonstop. Nicole Perlroth is an investigative reporter. She's also done a bunch of keynotes and has been published in various places, but I think she cut her teeth at the New York Times. She was involved in some of the early analysis of the Snowden leaks, etc., of the documents. And then this particular book deals with essentially the early days of zero-day markets. So like cyber warfare involving nation states and the early access brokers who would buy and then resell 0 days, which would and then it oftentimes turn into them being weaponized, and then how various governments got involved to take 0 days off the market so the bad guys wouldn't be able to use them, etc. It's very fascinating, and I've been doing Infosec for almost 25 years now, and this is like right around the time early on, late 90s, when this really started being a thing. So she refers and mentions a whole bunch of people and names in that book that are very familiar, some of which I've encountered over the years, some of which I just know about. And it's fascinating. My various work backgrounds prior to domain tools also nicely dovetail into this. I learned some things about some certain things, how they were happening, that make a whole lot more sense now based on what I've seen. So I highly recommend it if you're at all interested in whatever brief history comparatively Infosec has. This does a really nice job summarizing how certain things came to be, how there was early companies that would essentially buy 0 days from just people who would find them and then make some money of it, and then it would be commercialized. But when the nation states enter, and even like United States government agencies, to try to buy 0 days to not let them be used by adversaries is pretty fascinating. There's various discussions of some of the more well-known high-profile cyber attacks. Stuxnet gets discussed at length and how that came to be. So that's where it crosses over to Ian's recommendation. She talks about WannaCry, ransom, and the ransomware attack, and what was all related to that.
Let's talk about the book. That's why we're here today. What would you say was the catalyst in why you decided to write this book?
So I've been focused on this issue of China, again, for many years. In fact, the defining moment in my career was actually in 2010 when I was still at a company called McAfee, at the time one of the largest cybersecurity players. I was running their global threat research and investigations, and I got a call from Google, who had just been hacked by China, and they wanted to cooperate with us because a number of McAfee's customers were impacted in that incident as well, and ultimately named it Operation Aurora. It was the first time that the public sort of became aware that you had nation-state actors that were breaking into private companies, stealing intellectual property. I thought it was a completely watershed event. It literally a year later led me to found CrowdStrike. But at the same time, I was also really upset that the U.S. government was ignoring this problem. And it's not that they weren't aware of what was going on. They had all this classified intelligence of what China was doing. So at the most senior levels, they knew about the problem, but they wouldn't talk about it publicly. In fact, at the time, you couldn't get a senior government official, or any government official, in fact, to use the word cyber and China even in the same sentence. For whatever reason, they thought that would be provocative, that it would somehow compromise our sources and methods. Of course, now we're doing it every day and with no downside. But I was having these conversations post-Aurora and other investigations I did at the time, Night Dragon, Shady Rat. And I remember sitting in the Situation Room in the White House, really saying, folks, like, this is a massive problem. They're stealing everything we've got. This is, I coined this phrase at the time that's been now repeated often, this is the greatest transfer of wealth in history, what China is doing to our industry, to our economy. And everyone was like, okay, Dimitri, let's not use hyperbole. We'll out-innovate them. That was literally the comment that was made to me. We are the best and brightest. We'll always be better. And I thought that was unbelievably naive, if not condescending, to people in China, who, of course, are just as bright as we are. And I always thought that, particularly using my experience from the Soviet Union and understanding that history, that you can absolutely steal and innovate at the same time. In fact, the counterexample I used at the time is the atomic bomb, where the Soviets stole the designs from the Manhattan Project and then replicated that initial atomic bomb in 1949, but then later developed their own designs for the hydrogen bomb, innovating, right? And stealing just helps you to shortcut to that innovation. In fact, that's what we've seen in China, where companies like Huawei now and Baidu and TikTok and their battery industry, their EV industry, a lot of those companies were initially benefiting from stolen intellectual property enabled by cyber IP theft. And now they're producing products that are arguably some of the best in the world, certainly in EVs, certainly in batteries, certainly in telecom with Huawei. And it's not an accident, because you got smart people, you're stealing all these research designs, you're going to iterate on them a lot faster than Western competitors, and add on top of that the unfair trade practices, the price dumping, and overcapacity and everything else that they're doing, and they're going to win. And I was very passionate about that early on, and I felt like this is something that we absolutely have to focus on. Now it's becoming much more common sense, and the reason I wrote this book, to give you a very long-winded answer to your question, is because I'm now concerned not just about losing to China economically, because I think that risk is actually fairly low. They can still dominate a lot of our industries. But I'm worried about what that dependence on Chinese technology will mean in terms of Taiwan and avoiding and deterring a conflict over Taiwan. And the catalyst for my decision to actually sit down and write this book, which took 2 years, was the war in Ukraine. I was one of the first geopolitical analysts to have predicted that Putin was going to invade Ukraine about 3 months before it happened. At the time, widely criticized for my prediction as being hyping up the threat by many sort of the deans of foreign policy establishment here in DC. Unfortunately, I was proven right, and I felt pretty passionate that it was time to warn the nation, to warn the world, that we've got an even more disastrous conflict ahead of us, and if we don't act quickly, we're going to be in a world of hurt, a conflict with China or allowing them to dominate Taiwan.
Dimitri, if I could ask a question on this, because this is actually one of the topics that I was really interested in talking about, which is the why behind writing the book. Because obviously here in 2024 and recently, you have access to the people in Washington, for example, who need the information that you have and the knowledge that you have and the insight that you have, and are in a position, I'll say this as someone who's very far outside of DC, to actually do something about it. So we're past this first point where they weren't paying enough attention or trying to ignore the threat. So clearly they're there now. Was this book more because you feel like people in and around government who are in a position to do something about it, leaders of perhaps technology companies and political leaders, still are chasing and not getting ahead of how the worldview and the geopolitical landscape is changing? Or is it more for, I'm going to call it the masses, people like me who have an interest in the topic, who just want to get more up to speed on the geopolitical landscape, but aren't necessarily like in the inner circle of being able to do something about it?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Tim. And this book is specifically not written for the 300 people that are part of the DC foreign policy blob, as it's often called. Look, I see those people on an almost daily basis anyway and talk to them extensively. I don't need to write a book to reach them. This book is for the broader public, both here in this country and across our allies, to wake people up to this threat in a way that I think they're not awake today. And I will challenge your premise, Tim, because I don't think that the solutions here are exclusively for people in the White House or in the halls of Congress. Each and every one of us can contribute to increasing the deterrence against Chinese invasion of Taiwan and domination of that region. Because in part, what you've seen is that their rise to power has been enabled by who? American businesses, American intellectual property transfers, the attractiveness of the Chinese market letting companies do really dumb things for both, I would argue, their own companies and the future of those companies, as well as the broader national security of this country. So the book is an attempt to be a call to action to all of us, not just our leaders in government, to think about every day what we could do to enhance that deterrence, whether you're in the cyber industry and you're battling the Chinese nation-state actors and others from other countries on a daily basis, whether you're an industry executive that is thinking about your strategy of both your presence in Chinese market, how to diversify, how to build more resilient and secure supply chains. All of that is as vitally as important as very specific strategies I also outline in the book related to military strategy, defense industrial base reforms, some trade measures to respond to Chinese activity. But it's incumbent upon all of us to really confront this threat, because I truly believe it's a civilization-defining threat that we face. Because let's be very clear, a conflict with China will be unlike anything that America has seen, should we go to war with China, since World War II, and perhaps even in terms of just daily casualty numbers, potentially could even exceed that. And, of course, China is a nuclear power, we're a nuclear power. The chances that conflict stays conventional below the nuclear threshold is not 100%. There's really high stakes for all of us here. And by the way, should China invade Taiwan, even if we don't fight, that's global depression right off the bat, right? Some of the estimates are that a war with Taiwan would cost $10 trillion worth of damage just in the first year, wipe out $10 trillion. So it will impact all of us. So don't just pretend, put your head in the sand and say, the White House, the Congress will figure it out. Because frankly, if you've been paying attention for the last decade or so of American politics, there's a lot of gridlock and not a lot gets done unless there's pressure from the grassroots. Will have unbelievably far-reaching ramifications for American prosperity, American dominance, American security. And that's what this book is really all about.
The book, again, is World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Thanks, everybody. Come back again next week for an all-new episode of Breaking Badness.
That's about all we have for this week. You can find us on Twitter @DomainTools. All of the articles mentioned today will be included in our blog post, which can be found at blog.domaintools.com. Catch us every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time when we publish our podcast and blog. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Breaking Badness. Until then, remember, don't drink and click.